Okay, so welcome everyone to this week's discussion. The topic is going to be how to write and create a nation. So we're going to be looking at how to make a core concept, the main areas sort of to focus on when writing a nation, such as economy, government and society. We're going to be looking at giving it source, positives and negatives, in-depth nation sheet topics, and give some good examples of nations in Ancerious as a whole. So first off, how to make a core concept. So when you're writing and creating a nation from scratch, you kind of want a core concept. And a core concept is a central idea that your nation is effectively built around, yeah? It doesn't have to be particularly in-depth or fleshed out, and it can be something extremely simple. For example, I want to run a religious AI. I want to run fusion-fueled speedsters, a confederation of disparate species, a dystopian corporate hellhole, etc. Now, that in itself is just a really basic premise. And that's going to give you, the foundation of what then to think on and explore. And it's essentially the spark for your nation. So, using inspiration on top of this is an important part of any process. And, your core concept may even be because you're inspired by a particular nation from a movie or a game, or you may not know how to expand or implement your core concept as a whole. So here especially we recommend, going online, look things up, get a cool different set of ideas and gather a good wide variety of inspirations, and then take key aspects from those inspirations and, concepts from different sources or artwork or whatever, and just mash them together and just sort of add your own ideas to the point where, you can have an original take. Don't try to make something that is extremely similar to your inspiration to the point where it kind of shows to everyone else, because then it becomes obvious. So, using these inspirations, you could expand on your core concept. You expand outwards, you take your small description of your core, and you start making it into a couple of sentences, yeah? So, for example, corporate dystopia, which focuses on industrial output, stays low-tech to keep its workforce population in check, while the elite enjoy the high life, and it has a focus on building galactic civilian electronics. So, now your core concept goes from, a really vague idea to something that's a little bit more focused, and it's expanded. And that idea that you've now come up with, thanks to the inspiration of further thinking, you can adequately now, make these few sentences and have them as a strong foundation. So that when anyone comes to you and says, what's your nation like, you can effectively just copy and paste that sort of, core concept and go like, well, this is really a general overview. So now that you have your concept and, a rough guide for your nation, now you can actually start writing your sheet. So you want to incorporate your idea into it, and you want to build around it. So remember to keep your focus to your concept, and bring that focus and that concept into, the main areas of your nation, which are going to be government, economy and society. But always logically think of how it would impact other areas, diplomacy, culture, military, technology, etc. And use this foundation as a real good guide to build upwards. But don't let it be restrictive, alright? Things can change, and just because you have your foundations laid doesn't mean that everything has to be absolutely concrete, tied and set in stone, yeah? Just because your, say, corporate dystopia cracks down on its population doesn't mean that the population can't have a vibrant culture to try and cope with their lives. Nor does it mean that the corporation has to be some monolithic slab-sided government which all just has one identity. It could instead be really expansive and fractured with a story-filled struggle fest. Focus on what feels right to you, and don't let yourself be railroaded by the concept, yeah? Keep it in mind through every step, but don't let it absolutely force your hand into everything. Now, obviously, there's a flip side to this, and that is definitely keep your core concept close, because we have a lot of examples here of players who have come in, they've got an idea, they've got a concept for their nation, and they take it to their nation sheet, and then they write a bit, and then they think, oh, but if I change the core concept to this is cooler, and then they modify everything, and then they're like, oh, but what if I, and it basically just ends up being not even scope creep, it's just straight up like changing the idea every 5 minutes, and at the end of the day, like, pretty much, they're never finishing their sheets. They're never actually writing a nation because they're just throwing about 10,000 eggs at the wall and hoping that one of them sticks. So the main areas of focus are going to be your economy, government, and society. Yeah. So these are sort of been covered in depth by other discussions. And, we've included in the notes a Discord link to, each section. So when this gets posted up, you'll be able to easily go and read the other discussions. But as you go, you need to think your core concept and what to focus on. So with economics is really important because it determines your nation's ability to fulfill its demand and its own supply and how it reacts and interacts with supply and demand of the greater galactic economy. Most players brush over economics as a whole. They usually just go like, they have a capitalist economy and free market. They have a command economy. And they just call it a day, yeah? But economics can really help flesh out your core concept and help you when writing your nation. How does your sort of nation's idea impact the distribution of resources and goods within your nation? Yeah? How does it impact trade? What deficiencies does it cause? May your crazy authoritarian autarky be in such a state where it's pumping everything into its military and everything into its industrial, production, but it can't produce its own food or it can't produce these bits. So it requires actually a large amount of imports and certain resources to keep it going. How does your internal trade determine your strengths? Yeah. Does your nation focus on exporting any specific things? And how might that affect your concept and your nation as a whole? You've got to think of basically how creating a nation as like a web. And the meme with the crazy guy with all of the string and post-it notes really comes to mind here. But, everything kind of rolls into everything else. So, remember what important industries do your nation have? What are key to it? What do most of your citizens work in every day producing? Does your nation have a heavy industrial base where it's literally manufacturing physical items to sell? Or is it a services-based economy where everyone goes to like massive call centres all day and gets yelled at by like 90% of the galaxy because they're trying to restart their router every 5 seconds? So, how does your society impact the working environment? What's the general attitudes of the workplace? What are your views towards waste or reusing, etc.? There's loads of things to think about with economics, and as I said, we've already gone over the topic in another discussion. But just because you're not really involved in and knowledgeable about economics, doesn't mean that you can't think about these questions and how they will impact your nation and write them. So, don't gloss it over just because it's complex. You don't need any maths involved with economics, and you don't need super in-depth economic theory. It just adds extra dimensions to your concept, and it helps it make it feel alive. So the next one is government, and a government is a type of entity or organisation that allows for defined laws over a set area or country. It can be all-encompassing or as little as possible. So governments encompass the executive branch, where leaders make sweeping decisions, legislative branch, where power is held by where it handles everyday matters through official legislation, and it has the judicial branch, which handles typically the law side of things. So now that you have your concept, how does your nation handle these? Does it concentrate or disseminate executive power? Is legislative power held by a, central Congress, for example? Or is it devolved across your territory in lots of different subsects? Who or what has judicial power within your nation? And then, how do these all interact with what you're going for? How do these government sectors work within your concept, and how do they interact with your people? What's the chain of succession like in your authoritarian nation? What are your elections like for your democratic nation? How are these determined? What opposition groups are there, or political radicals are there, which may be trying to change things? Which you can then come up with ideas for. Oh, I've got an idea for an opposition group. Awesome. That means that there is now a counterculture in your nation that can go into the society section. So again, even if you are really basically just answering these questions with like one or two really quick offhand comments of, oh yeah, there's a political opposition group that believes in this, or like, oh well, there's a particular band of judges that hold most of the judicial official power in the nation. That's cool. Just that means that you now have a little thread to work off of later, yeah? So governments are large affairs which are, typically made up of far more than just an emperor or president and a noble house and senate, yeah? Delve into your different government types, which may be associated with your core concept, or take inspiration from existing nations and their systems. Chop and change things. Just because you want to be a democracy doesn't mean you just have to, like, literally go to Wikipedia and copy and paste the United States democratic system. For once, who wouldn't be democratic? Meme, I know, but, like, don't just take really basic stuff like, oh, I want to play an authoritarian nation. I'll just copy the Third Reich, or like, I'll just copy the Soviet Union. Look into different government types that might be associated with your concept, and then, go through a few of them. Come up with different ideas of things that might fit, might not fit. Just because you want to play a, I don't know, Soviet-style authoritarian nation, just because it's a crazy sci-fi universe, doesn't mean that all of its factors are going to be exactly, just copy, paste, and port. There might be some things that, aren't associated with some of the technology or societal changes in the future. So always give yourself these little, like, unique flares, because it can really help A, make your nation feel alive, and B, really distinguish it from just, definitely trying to take heavy inspiration from a particular something. So, governments are important and will be a big focus for your nation and major characters. Don't shy away from it. Don't feel like you have to spend everything in your government, but don't feel like you can just write a few paragraphs and sorted, like, put some handcrafting and put some time into it. And the last one is, society. And, society is the aggregate community of people that make up a nation. Yeah, it includes their views, cultures, well, everything really. And it can be as fractured or coherent as you want. So society, and by extension culture, is often overlooked or only really briefly touched on by many our peers and writers, especially in nation roleplay. Despite it being probably the most important factor to really making your nation, the difference between opening up a nation sheet and reading a nation roleplay entry, yeah? Or opening up a sheet and reading a living, breathing nation, one that somebody goes, wow, this is really cool, I can actually sort of imagine what it's like being here, yeah? Society and culture can focus on things that are often not really seen in RP, but which are very important, yeah? And they're typically only dropped in to add in extra sauce, but they can give you fun hints, and they can give you, funky story links, and generally flesh out your nation during RP posts in offhand comments, and it helps build up the nation setting to use as a basis for RP itself. I'm going to find it very hard as a player or a GM to do something in somebody's nation if they haven't actually fleshed out what their everyday nation is like, yeah? Because if I can't immediately picture what it's like on like an average city street corner in your nation, uh, generally what your population's like, what the environment's like, what the vibe is like, what the, I guess, general driving thought is for your people, well, I can't really either interact with it or create a roleplay there. Yeah? So, even if you are just dropping, little paragraphs or entries into just random RP posts, which hint and link to your nation's society and fun little cultural quips and little traditions or, whatnot, even just doing that can really help make the difference. Yeah? And then you can think about other things like, how does your society structure itself? Do you have the usual common denominator between rich and poor? Do you have a different way of hierarchy within your nation? Are there major class divides? How does it handle cultural and species differences within its nation? Are they pretty xenophobic? Are they pretty damn accepting? Yeah? What are of its main drivers and houses of thought? How does your core concept that you've taken fit into these and help drive, your houses of thought or whatnot? Because your core concept is going to pretty clearly influence or be influenced by the main sort of beliefs in your nation, yeah? And you can also use this to flesh out minor stuff as well, like how do they handle education, their workplaces? What do your people do in their leisure time? What's their art like? Do they have any funky national holidays? What's their religion like, and what major consequences does that have? Again, use inspiration. You can take cool ideas and you can mesh them together. Many people like to take huge inspiration from real life cultures, which is cool. I recommend doing this because obviously it's much easier for you to imagine, say, a Hindu-inspired society than it is for you to, come up with a completely unique society for Globnark 4. But at the same time, again, you can use it as a basis, but try to impact, put in other things as well. Otherwise, it will just look like a case of X in space. Like, oh, it's just the Romans in space. Oh, it's just the Third Reich in space. Oh, it's just the Soviet Union in space. Like, just don't go down that route. Try to make it distinctive. And that's where we sort of come into the next segment. And that is giving it source. Now, source is a term that is used in this group on the regular, introduced by our member Vice here. Source is the stylistic and aesthetic choices that you make to make your faction different from those that have the same base concept. Yeah? So you might have two factions here. Blue and him might have basically the same core concept for their nation, yeah? But their source is what defines those nations to make them totally different and unique, yeah? So, for example, both the Zetnian clan holds and the Third Republic of Corona are crazy hordes that cobble together technology into massive, insane things, yeah? But they both have extremely distinctive source, which completely differentiates them. Both the Lithorians and the Mai are hive minds, which is a core concept, but they are completely different people, like completely different factions. Both Lystunganos and Orbioli are secretive, manipulative factions, but again, they have different focuses, etc. So, this is how you would use it to differentiate. So, one way to give a faction source is to give it a distinct aesthetic. And this is typically done through visual design choices and artwork. Typically, sort of, typically sort of used when doing design philosophies, yeah. So when you draw ships or characters or anything really for that nation, you kind of have this artistic expression that focuses around that aesthetic, yeah. And it can really help differentiate your core concept from someone else's. So, for example, I touched on Lystunganos and Orbioli, yeah? Well, both are hyper-secretive, underhanded nations, but Lystunganos goes heavy into the cyberpunk aesthetic, yeah? While Orbioli goes kind of like the German Stasi and the secret police and social engineering. So, while they are basically the same core concept-wise, their distinct aesthetics, especially in terms of visuals, totally different. And because of that, it can help make them very, very distinctive nations. Another way to give a faction, source, is to give it unique interactivity. Okay? And this can be sort of interesting and new approaches to diplomacy, ideology, combat, politics, anything really, and gives players who interact with that nation an experience an RP that is very unique, yeah, and stays with them for a while. It keeps them coming back for more. For example, the ASN for Blue is a collection of states and individual nations, yeah, but they're all tied together under a loose singular authority. But because they have so much competition internally, different ideologies, different factions, different vibes, it makes each interaction with the nation feel extremely fresh and just part of one massive intrigue plot, okay, where nothing is ever quite the same. And because of that, it makes it really, really unique interaction-wise, yeah? So it's stuff like that. Making something cool and unique and how people can, do stuff with it in RP can really attract players and differentiate yourself from another. Another method of how to give your faction source, and this is kind of the one that you can definitely do at the start, yeah? So the other two you kind of have to like build up through art or through RP or whatever. You can kind of do unique interactivity in your nation sheet, but the final one is really something you can do from the get-go, and that is to give yourself internal story plots ready to go straight off the bat, yeah? And you can do this pretty easily. You can have already unstable politics in your nation on the road to civil war. You could have existing disputes with another nation. You could have the fact that your nation's economy is on the precipice of a collapse, yeah? You could introduce any of these story elements right at the start, okay? And allows you to effectively join the server, not just this server, any server really, and you can hit the ground running, okay? You don't need to say wait around for other RPs or whatnot. You could even run your own. You can essentially just go, hey, I've already got these things going. I can introduce my internal story elements into RPs with other people and give people hooks that might want to get them involved with me. And you can have a consistent flowing direction with your nation that allows other players to easily RP with you and get involved in your stories. And it looks like your nation has logical, normal, organic progression because you've got an ongoing story, yeah? So don't just sort of create your nation as this sort of, I guess, slab-sided static entity, which you can then use in RP. Come up with some cool ideas that could potentially have some plots off the bat. And then you can plonk it down and be like, well, I'm ready when you are, when you want to do some of these things. And it really helps get you involved. So that kind of nicely goes into the next one, which is positives and negatives for your nation, yeah? So, surprise, nations aren't perfect, okay? And there's no perfect nation that's ever existed IRL, yeah? No place is perfect. Everything's far from perfection. Everything has aspects that could be improved upon, yeah? And this should absolutely be the case for your nation. Absolutely. When writing a nation, it is important to not only think about what your nation will be good at, but also what they will be bad at, okay? Because so many players, when writing a nation, focus on their nation's strengths, okay? So they're like, oh, well, I'm going to play a nation that's going to have really good technology, or they're going to have a really effective and well-represented government, or I'm going to have a strong communal society where everyone's like really ideologically coherent, or I'm going to go and have a like post-scarcity economy where I can basically have everything and do whatever I want. And those are just sort of like the usual that we find that people submit here. However, you don't actually see these people focusing on weaknesses. They don't go like, oh, well, maybe I actually don't have that very good tech, or maybe my government's horrifically corrupt, or maybe my strong communal society is actually fractured into loads of different ideologies, or maybe my economy is actually like on the verge of total collapse. Yeah? They don't really do that. But a nation's weaknesses are absolutely, in my opinion, way more important than your strengths, because they're crucial to making it realistic, relatable, and well written, okay? Because let's face it, it's all well and good if you want your nation to be like, oh, well, I'm super duper at this, that, and the other. Well, that's cool, and that's kind of to be expected when you have a lot of people coming from, say, more competitive roleplay environments. Because at the end of the day, and I think a fair few, there's a lot of new people in the chat at the moment. Welcome, by the way. Really nice to see you. I know that a lot of other places are kind of the case of like, oh, I have to have the best things. Or I can't really show any weakness in my nation because it's just going to get immediately exploited by anyone else, yeah? I can't, say, focus on a cool civil war plot because it's just going to get derailed by like 4 other players who think it's fun to fuck with my nation and, you know, try and annex me or whatever. Well, you know, to quote the Black Panther meme, we don't do that here. We emphasise story at all costs. And nations' weaknesses are your absolute crux upon how you build awesome story. This is sort of a side tangent, but I can tell you now, as somebody who has had pretty much all apart from one of his main nations completely and utterly get, like, essentially reduced to sort of like 0 and have to work back from the ground up, best things I've ever done. And the one nation that hasn't, it's on the way. It's on the way. That's going to be a big plot that's coming. But like, it's so fun to write losing, and it's so fun to write these weaknesses getting exploited and causing all of these different things to happen. So, you know, focus on weaknesses. Believe me, it's really fun. Now, obviously, your core concept that you've come up with for your nation is going to be really, you know, obvious that it comes with inherent strengths and weaknesses, yeah? For example, your corporate dystopia hellhole will likely have a strong economic base and industrial base, but a degrading, you know, and poor society with little in the way of personal rights, maybe a corrupt and ineffective government, and you can use your concepts and inspiration as guiding factors when placing both your strengths and weaknesses into your nation. In my experience, if you try to give your nation something really good, try to give it something not so good. So, oh, I want a really powerful industrial economy. That's cool. You have a really shitty, corrupt government. You know, like something like that. Just something to sort of balance it out. Now, it's okay if your nation is all right. Like, you know, it doesn't have any glaring weaknesses, but it might not have any super strengths either. Just don't try to, you know, go crazy. So, you know, remember, you know, your weakness in your nation does not actually, inverted commas, make your nation weak and easy to exploit, yeah? Again, it's not competitive, yeah? Instead, weaknesses show that your nation has legitimate shortfalls, okay? And it allows you to work those into internal stories that players can interact with, okay? So, say you've decided to go with an unstable political or societal scene that can lead to your nation going into perhaps a civil war or an internal conflict, okay? This means that you now have a plot hook for other players to get involved into your nation, to support different elements in your government, to perhaps try and prop up your government to stop a civil war in the first place. You now have really good interactivity, yeah? Or you have a shitty economy. Well, that's cool. I'm going to come and maybe invest into your nation. So it fixes that problem, or at least attempts to, and now our nations are much closer diplomatically, and I get a benefit out of it as well in character. You know, these things breed really good story plots, use them as such. And of course, you know, when creating your nation, avoid OP-ness and hand waving as much as possible, yeah? Especially when it comes to your nation's strengths. If your nation is a backwater race that's just invented the FTL drive, yeah, and is going to the stars and they're natives, whatever, why do they mysteriously have pion beams in their tech section? Or why do they mysteriously have phasic shields? Why do they mysteriously have like insanely good power generation or like all these other technologies that are like superior or whatnot? Surely if they're only just getting to the FTL stage, they should be starting low tech and building upwards. Yeah? That seems a bit strange, yeah? Keep your stuff grounded. Don't try to be like, oh, well, I have a super duper epic post scarcity economy. And then when somebody goes, post scarcity doesn't work, and then you just go, oh, well, it does. It just, you know, it's just sort of hand wave because we have this like technology or whatnot. Well, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. Yeah. You know, hand waving stuff is fine for some story purposes, depending on what it is, okay? And having particularly powerful strengths is fine if it makes sense logically for your core concept and what you're going for, and if it's beneficial for the story, yeah? But keep the group mantra, and I hope this sticks with you, OP or hand wave, never both. The moment you try to have something that's super duper amazing, but it's also kind of hand wavy, that's where we step in and say, hell no, you're not doing that. Because we've had people do that before. It's the crux of bad RP, it's the crux of bad writing. There is no point in doing it. Yeah? It doesn't get you anywhere. So, next section, we're going to go sort of like in depth on some sort of less touched on nation sheet topics that you might typically find when writing in this particular sheet. Obviously, this applies to Ancerious, but the first one is leadership. Okay, now this is actually surprisingly important when creating your nation, and a lot of players just kind of don't put the emphasis into it that I believe that you should. And I'm not asking you to write like essays upon essays about infinite characters, okay? But most people just sort of put their leader or leaders' names and like a little bit about the power position that they fill. But, you know, the key is to use this section to just give an idea into who they are, yeah? Who are your leaders or individuals in key positions of power? What are they like? What are they like as people? What ideology do they believe in? What's their personal drive, yeah? What's their personal beliefs? Do they fully support what's going on in your nation at the moment? Do they believe that perhaps, you know, things aren't actually going as well as they should, so maybe we should do something different? Are they at odds with other people in your leadership? What outlook do they have, you know, for the nation as a whole? What do they believe in doing for the nation's future or the driving of thought? You know, you can use this section to, again, you don't have to do like whole character sheets, but just like a paragraph of, you know, fleshing out these characters with just a basic foundation. Obviously, you're going to be fleshing them out properly in RP, so again, you don't need massive character sheets about them, but just a general, what are they like? What are their motivations? Yeah? And you can use this, and this is a really good section to do it, to plant seeds for internal stories. Again, going to have a government schism? Is it because of these two particular characters that believe that, you know, maybe things haven't been handled very well in the nation and they want to do some change? Or maybe your Ministry of Finance is absolutely corrupt and has been siphoning off funds and fucking up the economy for years and it's on the precipice of collapse. Or, you know, maybe your leader is like a bit unhinged or has some problems or whatever. You know, there's lots that you can just, even an offhand comment here can be something that you can build on later. So don't underestimate the leadership section, because it could be really important. Another one is diplomatic doctrine. Again, this is kind of something that people just sort of put a little bit into and then leave it, yeah? And it's something that you can really help focus your concept for, because, you know, think about how your nation interacts with others as general, yeah? What's its stance on certain other ideologies, okay? How does your diplomacy change if it's a weaker nation? How does your diplomacy change if you're interacting with a stronger nation? What's your general foreign policy? Does your nation like to intervene in foreign affairs? Or does it generally keep to its own matters? Do they trade a huge amount? Do they not trade a huge amount? Do they, you know, try to interact with galactic organizations, or do they just do things on their own? You know, it can help give you a framework for how your nation will act on the galactic scene, but it also gives other players reading your sheet and nation a guide, an idea of how interactions with your nation will typically go, yeah? What can they expect in RP? And that could just be quite helpful and help flesh out your nation as a whole and your concept. So another one is homeworld. And, you know, homeworld details are usually an afterthought, or they're a small piece of lore in your nation sheet. Yet, if you're playing a unique species, they can pretty much often be heavily fleshed out and thought of, you know. You can still use your homeworld as a good basis for what might have moulded your people and your culture and society. How did its terrain and climate affect your, you know, culture or your species? How did its galactic location affect the rise of your nation? You know, just lots of random things like this can just help be a little bit of a funky addition to a nation sheet, just to make it feel a little bit more alive, yeah? Next up, history. You know, history usually comes in a few forms when we're reading nation sheets. Either it's very glossed over and lightly fleshed out with like, oh, some stuff happened and we're here now, or it's super duper giga fleshed out where like it's almost like somebody's writing a Hoi 4 timeline where there's like 5 pages of just like happenings, and there's like some stuff that's gone on, but then like the stuff's resolved, but then the stuff goes on, but then the stuff's resolved, and it kind of gets a bit chaotic. Or there's just a history section where like there's a lot of words, but there's no real content, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard to put forward, but like it is kind of the case in some examples. But history can, you know, really bring your nation to life and helps reinvigorate your foundation for the nation, yeah? And it also is fantastic for helping flesh out any internal stories that you want to write as well, yeah? And it can tie in any character development for your leadership and your characters in that sense. You know, what major historical events got your nation to this point, okay? How did it shape your nation's driving houses of thought? What happened in your history to constitute your nation's strengths? Its weaknesses, its culture. You know, how might events that have happened in your history have caused your characters to get to where they are, your leaders, yeah? And how might it impact your nation's future and possible story routes for it to take, yeah? Use it as a blank slate for which you could build these things and then help incorporate them elsewhere, you know? And finally, we have, or not finally, but second to last one, military, okay? Now, you might be thinking like, well, Marek, everyone fills out military. And yeah, you'd be right, because military is possibly and usually the second most filled out section in nation sheets that we look at, yeah? But it's not fleshed out in the ways that it could be fleshed out, okay? Most people just sort of go into like doctrines and how their nations fight wars. That's cool. Absolutely, you can do that. But how does your military interact with your government? Does your government control the military? Does your military control the government? Do they have a weird relationship where they kind of have to keep each other in mutual respect? Does your leader have enough power to keep the military in line so that the military can keep the population in line? And what happens if he loses the respect of the military? Can they usurp him? Think about that sort of thing. What's your military's relation with your economy? Do they get sort of like a tiny fraction of your sort of nation's GDP for which to spend? Or is your nation's military a massive industrial machine within your faction, and it takes up vast amounts of resources and economic output, in which case it affects the rest of your nation? How does your nation's culture and your core concept that you've created to write your nation impact how your military wages war? Does it mean that they have a strict system of what they can do on the battlefield? Does it mean that, perhaps they might find certain approaches to warfare dishonourable or against their very sort of foundation? An example would be my religious nation, the EOS Consortium, sees stealth as a sin, essentially. It's blasphemy. So they don't do any sort of stealth warfare or subterfuge. They always fight up front, close range, where they can see the enemy in the eye. And how do these things approach and affect the procurement of your new systems? Perhaps your culture is super mega progressive and you always have to have the newest cutting edge stuff. So your military procurement is just a non-stop clusterfuck of constantly trying to produce new and competing weapon systems which are the best in their line, but they're absolutely horrifically unreliable and untested. Or perhaps they're super traditionalists and they've got a load of commanders and general staff who believe that, we're not going to implement these new weapon systems or tactics because, we're tried and true and we're going to do the same thing and it's all going to be okay, yeah? It doesn't all have to be about waging conflict. It all doesn't have to be about how you shooty gun and who you shooty gun at, yeah? Sometimes delving into how your military fits into your nation's structure itself can be more helpful in fleshing out your military than how they shooty gun, okay? And the final one is technology, okay? Now, this is usually the largest segment of most nation sheets that we go for because people like to write a lot for it. And sometimes people like to treat the technology section as a shopping list, okay? And they just sort of take whatever they want. But they don't think about what they might need, okay? Technology is a massive factor in your nation because you've got to think about the fact that how does your technology base affect your society, yeah? How does it affect your construction, your economy, your population, how you handle political succession or whatnot? How does it handle your day-to-day lives? You've got to think about what technology you're choosing for your nation and how it will affect things, yeah? There's no use taking your democratic, not America faction, yeah, which is pretty normally blankly equivalent to America today, okay, and giving it super quantum AI, and then having those AI rarely, if not at all, impact your society. Well, why the fuck aren't those quantum AI being used in design? Why aren't they being used in political management? Why aren't they being used in economic management? Why aren't they being used to run vast swathes of factories or military forces or whatnot? Now, if you've written that they are being used as that, awesome, cool. But if they're not, you need to give a reason for why, because if there's a technology which would cause super revolution and change your very society, well, if it's not changing your society, either you need to think up a damn good reason for why it isn't, or you need to get rid of it from your technology sheet, yeah? You can always think about if there are any technologies that might be forbidden in your nation, in character, but at the end of the day, you need to think about how your technology might conflict with your nation's source and core concept. Because again, try to keep it in line and don't go overboard. Just because you like the look of big shooty lasers that are super hard to counter doesn't mean that your nation needs them. Again, if you've got some, like, low-tech medieval inspired faction, why the fuck are they running around with, like, black hole generators and fucking, like, Kugel Blitz beams? Keep it logical, yeah? And think about how it will affect your people, because oh boy, we've had some real prime examples of players who have come in, made a shopping list of tech, and then have none of it affect their nation, despite the fact that, crazy things would be different, okay? Especially if you've got psionics or magic, okay? And I cannot stress this enough, because this is another factor that I've seen. If your nation has access to psionics or magic, and it doesn't have that as a sort of integral core part of its society or its core or, its source, why the hell do you have it? Okay? It's cool if you're planning it as like they're actually diving into psionics, and the psionics they've got at the moment is really fucking baseline, and they're still researching, and that's sort of a plot line that we're going to go down. Cool, that's fine, no problem with that. It's when you say that you have, like, super duper battle mages of magic, and like an order within your nation where you have, like, super duper mages, but the rest of your nation is just like some random technocracy, and magic doesn't have any influence anywhere else outside of this order of super battle mages. At that point, we turn around and go, no, if that doesn't fit, remove it. Yeah? So, again, please, dear God, make sure that your tech and capabilities of your tech are reflected within your nation, okay? And finally, I've got some sort of examples of nations in Ancerious that we consider really good, what their base is and what their source is, yeah? So first off, we've got him and his Zetyans, and their base is that they're sort of crazy rat people. And their source is that they're crazy rat... No, I'm joking. Their source is that they're an oligarchic empire populated by tall, sociopathic, six-eyed mammals, comprising of multiple bickering clans and renowned for their peoples being unstable and trigger-happy to the extreme. They are currently one of the major players of one of the major alliances, and that they have an affinity and leaning, for humour and nonsense, okay? So everyone's immediately like, oh, the Zetyans are here. This is going to be a funny and silly sort of example. But because people see that they're silly and funny, they actually take them seriously, okay? And because of that, everyone loves them in this group. Next up is the Union of Worlds, which is my main nation. The base is that they're a confederation of species working together for a greater good. Pretty fucking basic concept, and you can take that a billion ways. The source is that they're, a diverse and in-depth approach to different races, and they've kind of got an optimistic Star Trek-esque society where it's like, oh, utopia, but it's kind of straddling the line where it could really easily turn into an evil, horrific dystopia, and there's an emphasis on angelic aesthetics with bright militarism and, really angular, jagged triangles. Next up is Krag's nation, Carnath. Its base concept is that it's a corporatist empire, but its source is that it's populated by radiation-resistant space furries, which are uniquely done, with an affinity for genetic modification and an aesthetic for angular classical inspiration merged with postmodern cyberpunk design language. Really quite gets things going in that regard. There are sort of premier how to make an anthro species well. Next up is Blue's nation, Natar. The base is that it's a collection of competing and totally different states. Its source is that this includes, aristocracies, republics, populistic monarchies, technocratic democracies, mercantile nation states, and all of those are unified under a UN-type entity that maintains unity and cohesion through gangsterism, corruption, and coercion. Because there's so many different factions in it, it's got so many different aesthetics, including 50s gangster aesthetic, neo-Gothic architecture, 18th century French neoclassical and Rococo, glowing bioluminescence, frontier westernism, and, I could keep going. But it's just such a conglomeration of things that, every interaction with it is a different one. And lastly, we have the Surstein, which are Rex's faction, which is, the base is that they're a bunch of nomadic space people, but their source is speed. and how it's applied to absolutely every single facet of their society, okay? Including themselves. So their aesthetics is pretty much, they absolutely love race cars and just going fast in general, and their designs draw from, race cars, missiles, fighter jets, and they have a religion about going fast, and they talk fast, and they write an illegible Dr. Chicken Scratch fast. Everything's fast. They're always constantly going as fast as possible. These are just the sort of like off the top of the head ones. I'm sure that there's loads of other awesome, nation concepts out there with awesome source. But the point is that you can take a really basic concept and use source to make it unique. Yeah? Well, that's pretty much all I've got. So, does anyone want to type in the chat if they want to add anything or ask any questions? It's right. Let me have a look at the question. So, what are the rules for this? What do you mean by that? Oh, okay, yeah, no. Yep. Sort of. I, from what it sounds like, you're kind of going too deep. Like you're focusing way too much on super giga details of like biology and not actually going for a core concept. It sounds like you're starting with the absolute nitty gritty details and working upwards, which is not what you want to do. You want to start at the bottom and go. You want to start and go forwards. Yeah. Don't work backwards. Cool. Anyone else have any questions or anything they want to add? There is no current people typing. Did you want to add anything, Blue or Vic? Awesome. All right. Well. Oh, sorry, I got a question. What sort of sources would you recommend not pursuing? I think Eamon really sort of touched on that in detail in the last discussion, which is effectively like tropes and such that you really don't want to go down, like authoritarian with strong individual liberties and like super giga AI with post scarcity economies, and like don't go down any sort of source route that would see your nation be either too perfect, too chaotic, or too much like another nation. Okay? So, for example, if I wanted to go down a route for, I guess, an authoritarian fascist dictatorship, I wouldn't try to model them on like a cross between Greece, sort of like Greek aesthetic, the Soviet Union's aesthetic, coupled with like the Third Reich and original stuff, because otherwise I'd just get capital. So if you aren't trying to come up with a good source for a new group, have a read of what the group's factions are like first, so that you're not just sort of like creating something that already exists. If you happen to make a nation that ends up really similar to another person's, it's up to you to try and distinguish it, because at the end of the day, they're here first, and I know that sounds kind of like dickish, but you know, they're here first and established, so it's kind of on you to work around them, not them to work around you. So it would be up to you to try and make things suitably different so that we could be able to distinguish the two nations. Go on, Blue, if you'd like to add to that. Yeah. So, like, if you wanted to play, I don't know, Space USSR, and you come into the group and you've literally made the Space USSR, and there's already another, you know, nation that's like the USSR but has distinctiveness, but you're just like, oh, it's kind of similar. It's like, well, that's because you've just ported, like, X in space, you know? Like, it's very easy to make nations distinctive. Just try to avoid the most basic, overarching, like, stuff, if you know what I mean. We don't just casually allow nations to be galactic threats. That's not what we do here. I know that it's a very common thing in a lot of other like roleplay servers to have like a new galactic threat every other hour, but here galactic threats, like, they have to be built up over years and years and years of RP. Um, every nation joins this group on the same wavelength, so I don't see how your, like, normal nation will start off as a galactic threat unless you somehow have god tech, which isn't allowed anyway. I've already covered in another discussion how to make a galactic threat slash, like, super evil sort of, I guess, antagonist, and all how to do that. But yeah, we don't allow players to just come in and be like, oh, I'm playing Devouring Swarm number 462, and I will, like, go and kill everyone. So yeah, we don't do that here. Miss Cup says, oh god. So, hold on, I've got another question here first. Miss Cup says, is there such a thing as making a nation too weak? There is something like very inferior as a term, and I'm unsure if that is used as a negative or positive connotation. Oh, so very inferior is not a negative connotation. It is literally just your tech level. So, like, very inferior would be kind of like modern tech, okay? Or, like, just a little bit more advanced than what the tech that we have today, okay? And then you have inferior, and then you have average, superior, very superior, yeah? It's not negative in any way. There are many very inferior nations in the group. There's many inferior nations of the group, and they have won so many battles against superior and very superior nations. You know, it's just a term to show what tech level you are, like what level of tech you are, yeah? Um, as such a thing for making a faction too weak, yes, there is. We have had in the past 2 years a lot of people try to make sort of like medieval or Stone Age stuff in space, where they've just taken like absolutely atrocious level tech with like swords and spears and tried to like have a nation. Um, if your core concept prevents you from easily interacting with another player, you need to change your core concept. Yeah? So if your tech level is so bad that you don't have access to FTL or like interaction, you either need to have a story lined up, ready to go the moment you join the group, where your nation gets FTL or is able to interact, or you change it. So Blue's nation here is started with no FTL, but his first RP was Natar meeting the Union, and the Union basically like opening them up to the galaxy, yeah? And then Natar just went on from there as a normal faction. So, yeah. Should there be special consideration taken into language and communication? No. In my opinion, if you want to do that in a first contact, sure, go for it, but no to the point where it like actually detracts from story. I've actually done another discussion on first contact and the whole like language barrier thing that I can link you in a bit. Any other bits and pieces? And yeah, for the whole like USSR in space, there is actually like multiple USSRs in this group that are all distinctive. Question: if a nation has no religion but consider their own society / culture, would their religion be realistic or simply not possible? What do you mean? Sorry, I don't understand. As in, considering their own culture or society as a religion? Yes. I mean, yeah. Like, it depends how ingrained it is. Like, they might worship the state. Uh, can a nation essentially consider its culture or society a religion? Yeah. Yes and no, but like, yeah. Any other questions to write in context? Miss Cup is typing, so I will let her type it out. Would such things like figuring out how things can be seen as mundane or non-notable for a nation, but possibly very valuable in others? Like the views of material. I mean, yeah, that's economics. That's pretty basic economics. What one nation might find not useful at all, one nation might be in desperate need for, and that's why you trade. Right. Anything else, or doing that. What kind of RPs are best to build source for my new faction? Oh, that is a very good question, Blue. I would say, so normally we always do starter RPs, yeah? And typically we will try to make your starter RP always have some sort of impact on the galactic canon, yeah? Tie in with some sort of potential story arc, okay? And that will hopefully give you some plot tie-ins, which will allow you to flesh out and show off your nation in the starter RP, but also give you a chance to then get involved with a bigger story or pursue your own stories from that RP. Yeah. If you want to do stuff other than that, well, start fleshing out your internal storylines. Yeah. Go on. Yeah. Yeah. I'd agree with that. But yeah. As Drac also says in the chat, basically any RP that is likely to have the most interaction. Yeah. You develop source by interacting more and finding distinctions in your interaction. So, anything else? Yeah. Yeah. I'd also say try to be very open in regards to feedback for faction source because, like, also another thing as well is that, especially if you're doing art for your nation, getting feedback and like ideas from everyone else can help other people sort of like point you in a good direction for creating something distinctive. And yes, Blue, you may add something. Yeah. Definitely sell yourself, like get yourself out there. The most distinctive and unique and most saucy factions in this group are those that are involved. It's sort of as simple as that, you know. Him here and Blue both went from like sort of new joiners to, I would almost say, like usual server and like nation names in only a few months, purely because they got involved in a load of stuff, but they ran their own RPs. And you know, there's always people in the server who want to RP, even if it is just something really small like a character RP. Just like, oh well, there's some weird stuff going on in my nation. Some like political figure has hired a group of like random dudes to like go and figure it out. You know, perfect, awesome. That then means that other people are now going into your nation. You get to write about your nation's internals. It gives them an idea how your nation is like. It allows other people to read the RP and see what the internal of your nation is like, get a feel for your nation, and gets other people invested into your story. Yeah? People want to see how this political chaos ends. They want to see what ramifications their actions have on your nation. Yeah? Your faction is not just an entity for you to RP with, it's a setting in itself for you to use to generate RP and story for other people. Yeah? Think about it that way. Yeah. Yeah. Romando asks, what's some advice for running RPs if you have little to no experience? I will link in the chat a bit later a link to how to run and maintain RPs as a GM to give you some idea. So, and Miss Cup, I will also link you to the discussion on leaders for a nation, which will help you with that as well. So, anything else? Or is that it? Um, okay, so this is more like a rules thing that writing, Captain Waterbubble writes. How rewritable is the stuff in a nation after it's already been submitted and approved? Like if there's a major societal change triggered in RP and stuff like that. If there is reason for a major societal change or whatever that's happened in RP, right away. It's fine to add extra stuff and source as you're like developing your nation, because obviously you might be adding stuff that you never thought of before or expanding things. It's usually typical in this group for as you go on, you sort of edit your sheet now and again. Maybe like after a year or so, you might like update it with new stuff and expand it. Typically, as people get older in this group and more involved, Their nation sheet grows exponentially with new stuff as it gets fleshed out to cover. My fiance is currently looking at me with eyes at my over 300-page nation sheet. I cry every time. But yeah, so like, it's fine as long as you have reason. Yeah? As long as you are adding things that make sense, that work in character, that have been established. It's only when you're changing, so like, major stuff out of nowhere that we kind of get a little bit suspicious. But yeah, that's fine. But yeah. And a little bit that Blue is sort of answered in relation to the advanced advice for running RPs. If you have little to no experience, start small. Yeah, 1 or 2 players maximum. Keep it simple. Yeah, rather than inviting shit tons of people in and having a clusterfuck. Anything else? I see nobody typing. Okay, in that case, we will cut it there for tonight. So thank you all, and see you next time.